And as I said, you're on your way to meet someone for dinner. You've made a commitment to meet someone. So you're going to be a few minutes late. So there was that commitment, but in this case, that commitment is outweighed by the need to save a life, right? We balance the norms. I mean, does anyone really differ from that assessment? And here we had a situation, you know, we have conflicting norms, we have a certain factual pattern, but we make judgments like this effortlessly every day of our lives. We balance and weigh norms, we evaluate the situation, we come to a conclusion, and to the extent anyone ever bothers to think about it, they usually agree with our assessment. So in fact, there's not only just a set of core norms, but there's ways, accepted ways to interpret and evaluate those norms, and that can take us a fair amount of the way to developing policies. But of course, there are other steps we have to take as well. Next step I have up there is provisionally include norms generally accepted within a particular culture. As I said, the presumption of acceptance could be rebutted. Now again, I've given this talk before CFI audiences, they're always very sophisticated people. Say, oh, you're endorsing relativism. No, I'm not endorsing relativism. But if you're thinking about public policy in particular, why not begin provisionally? Again, I say it's a rebuttable presumption. But provisionally begin with the norms that are accepted within one's culture. Because what would the alternative be? Accepting norms that were accepted in medieval France? Right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You know, begin with the norms that are widely accepted within one's culture. And in fact, you know, I talked about universal morality and the kind of core norms about don't steal, don't kill, keep your promises. But there are certain norms, including norms I will talk about this evening, like respect for individual autonomy, that weren't accepted in past cultures, but are now widely accepted in most Western societies. So when we're talking about bioethics policy, I think, you know, we begin with that and see where it takes us. Well, what's the next step? If I could get your science and your facts straight. Seems to be kind of self-evident, and you might think, well, gee, okay, big deal. Well, actually, it's kind of important, especially in the area of bioethics, because we're talking about new technological developments, some scientific concepts that are not familiar to all people, and it's important, as I say, to get the science and facts straight. It's especially true, for example, in areas like stem cell research, where there's been huge debate about the status of the embryo, and, you know, in the United States at least, there was this argument, if you interfere with the development of the embryo, that's equivalent to killing an adult human being, right? Because the embryo is the same as an adult human being. Well, a lot of different problems with that, but one problem is that until 14 days after conception, you really don't have an individual. And if we assume that moral rights and wrongs can only be done to an individual, up to 14 days, there's no one there to really do a right or wrong to. That's because there's this phenomenon called, well, two phenomena, twinning and fusion. Because up to 14 days after conception, you can have the embryo split into two, become two individuals, or two things. At that point, they may be individuated. And also up to that time, you can actually have two embryos that fuse into one. It's called a chimera. So if, in fact, we're talking about rights and wrongs of the individuals, until 14 days after conception, you don't even have an individual, if then. So let's assume gives me a chance to take a walk first. Yeah, it literally floors people. Anyway, as I said, you know, embryonic stem cells will develop from embryos 5 days after conception. So at that stage, as I say, you don't really have an individual. So as I said, it's important to get your science and facts straight. Then I think you need to test your initial moral judgments by examining the consequences of adhering to those judgments. I'll be talking about assistance in dying in a second, and some of the arguments against legalizing assistance in dying depend on projections of horrible consequences. And, you know, to the extent those predictions actually prove to be true, we'll look at the situation in Oregon, that would have been one reason, perhaps, to reconsider the wisdom of legalization. You know, people have predicted that if legalized assistance in dying took place in Oregon, we'd have tens of thousands of people, you know, semi-voluntarily requesting this because they didn't have enough money to pay for health care, and Oregon would become a suicide mill. Well, those are weighty considerations, and so we should examine the consequences of our judgment and see what happens if, in fact, we take a certain course of action. Another thing we have to do is organize our judgments into sets of general principles that can explain and account for these judgments and check for consistency. What does that mean? Well, let me again make it that kind of abstract statement a little bit more concrete by talking about the assisted suicide or assistance in dying debate. In the United States, at least, I assume it's true in Canada, but I could be wrong. If a patient is being sustained by life-sustaining therapy, and the person is competent, and the person says, look, I don't want to keep up with this therapy. I know that if I have the therapy withdrawn, I stand a good chance of dying, but nonetheless, I want to stop. I want to stop the treatment. In the United States, a patient has an absolute right to stop the treatment, even knowing that the consequence of stopping the treatment will be that they're going to die. And even if they require the assistance of a physician or nurse to stop the treatment, because usually you're hooked up and whatever, you're not in good condition anyway, so you can't really just stand up and pull the plugs out yourself, right? So in that case, we have healthcare professionals assisting someone to bring about their death. Is that different than assistance in dying as is practiced in Oregon? And what happens in Oregon, we'll talk a little bit later about that in more detail. Terminally ill person has to make a series of requests. Again, this is to make sure the person's competent, really has a determination that they want to hasten their death. And if they persist with this, they're evaluated, it's determined they're competent, they can get a prescription from a physician for a barbiturate that they can use later if they decide that their situation becomes intolerable. So you're getting assistance from a physician that you may, in fact, want to use later to hasten your death. One interesting fact from Oregon is that a third of the patients who request this assistance, in other words, they get the prescription for the barbiturate, never use the prescription. They want the assurance that if things get too bad, they can hasten their death. But most people want to live as long as they get something out of life, right? So about 33% of the patients never use it. So first of all, a lot of people say, well, these physicians are bringing about the patient's death. Well, kind of hard to say when that only happens, 60% of the time that someone actually uses a prescription. But in any event, how is that different from withdrawing treatment that will result in the patient's death? I don't see any difference. I mean, there have been a lot of arguments about intention and whatever, and some people who say there's some difference. I don't see it. But in any event, that's one thing we have to do. We have to test our principles for consistency. All right, if I have the next slide. Then we articulate and understand the rationale for our norms and policies. And as I say, reflect on these and be prepared to defend one's framing assumptions. Again, sounds like kind of a mouthful. But what does that mean? Well, I think, again, as secular people, we should reflect on why we have certain moral norms. I mean, let's face it, back 150,000 years ago, or whenever it was, people started engaging in what we regard as moral behavior. They didn't sit around and think, well, gee, what we should do, what kind of policies should we have? No, it was a result of evolution. We developed these certain characteristics that made us empathetic to a certain extent, made us want to live together, and we developed these things not through any conscious process, but because they just happened. But now we're at the stage we can reflect on our moral norms and decide, well, gee, why do we have these rules? Do they make sense? And if we reflect on the rationale, sometimes that will help us decide what our policies should be. And I'll have two concrete applications later on when I'm talking about assistance in dying, and also when I talk about human enhancements. And finally, we have to determine whether norms can be implemented as a statute or regulation. Because don't forget, we're talking about public policy here. So it's not just a question of what you might want to do in an individual case. Like you might decide that, well, gee, if I help this person to die, maybe even if it's not really assistance in dying, but more like euthanasia,